She had been told to stand at the back. That was the sum of her instructions. Stand at the back, do not speak unless spoken to, and try not to embarrass the household by drawing attention. Wren had followed the first two. The third had always been harder for her than it was for most people. The great hall of Ashenmore held 43 women that morning, all of them in their finest gowns, all of them practicing the specific stillness of people who have rehearsed for a moment they cannot afford to waste. The selection came once in a generation, when an alpha king required a mate. When Mordecai Ashenvane, alpha king of the Northern Territories, sent word that the selection would be held at Ashenmore, the lords of the north sent their daughters and their wards, and whatever women of appropriate blood, they could assemble to the great fortress at the head of the mountain pass, where the king would walk among them in proximity, and the mate bond would do what it had always done. Recognize. That was the old word, the one the pack histories used. Not choose. Recognize. The bloodline of an alpha king carried a thread, and somewhere in the women of the territories was the answering thread. And when they came close enough to each other, the recognition occurred as a physical fact, a current beneath the skin, a sudden conviction that the room had rearranged itself around two fixed points. Every lord who had sent a candidate was hoping his woman carried that thread. Every woman in the hall had been told she might. Wren had not been told this. She had been told to stand at the back and not embarrass the household. She was here because Lord Cavendish had needed bodies to fill his quota, and she was available. A laundress's daughter from the outer staff, 20 years old, with a borrowed gown she had hemmed herself at midnight by rushlight because the lord's household did not waste candles on borrowed girls. The stitching was uneven. She had noticed this in the morning light and decided it was honest, which was the closest she usually got to comfort. She was small-framed and stood straight in the way of people who have learned that posture is the only dignity fully available to them. Her hair was dark honey shot through with copper, and in the torchlight of the great hall, caught fire at its edges when she moved. She had the kind of face that stopped thought before social calculation could intervene. High, clean cheekbones, a jaw with a decided line, a mouth with a readiness about it, as though whatever she was about to say would be more considered than expected. Her eyes were grey-green and startlingly direct, the colour of ice over running water, set beneath brows that had never quite learned discretion. Everything about her face said, "I notice things." It was the quality that had made her useful in the Cavendish household, and the quality that had also, periodically, made her trouble. She studied the room from the back, the way her mother had taught her to study rooms. Not for beauty, but for information, the exits, the guards at the doors, the two lords at the far end of the long table whose conversation had not paused when the king entered. Rooms told you things, if you knew how to read them. Wren had been reading them since she was old enough to understand that they had consequences. Mordecai Ashenvane, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, Sovereign of the 7 mountain packs, Lord of Ashenmore, entered without announcement. One moment the assembled court was performing its ceremonial stillness, and the next the air in the room had changed the way it changes before a storm. And he was there. He was tall in the functional way of men built for exactly the environments they occupied, dressed in black without ornamentation, a dark tunic under a leather overtunic fastened with iron buckles, riding trousers tucked into boots that had seen real use. His hair was black and close-cropped. His face was angular and severe, the jaw strong, the brow heavy, the nose carrying a slight imperfection that suggested it had been broken once and set without vanity. His eyes were amber, an unusual warm brown gold that caught the torchlight and held it, though there was nothing warm in what lived behind them. He looked like a man who had survived something large and emerged from it very certain about exactly how little room he could afford to waste on performances. He had a scar along the outer edge of his right hand, running from his knuckle to his wrist, pale and clean and clearly old. She noticed it because she always noticed scars. They were the most honest things about a person. He surveyed the room with a single sweeping glance that catalogued everything and revealed nothing, then took his seat at the high table, and the assembled court sat with him. The selection began its formal circulation. Lord Vane, the King's Chancellor, moved along the line with the systematic efficiency of a man conducting an inspection of something he had done many times, and found neither interesting nor offensive. His quill moved. His eyes assessed. Wren watched, not the high table, as most of the others were, but the room itself. Who watched whom? Which lords had shifted, fractionally, in their seats, which had not? She was at the back. She expected she would not be approached. She was wrong. It was not Lord Vane who reached her, it was the king. She did not see him moving. She was watching the Chancellor on the opposite side of the hall, and she registered his presence only when it was immediate, when she turned and found Mordecai Ashenvane standing 2 arm lengths away, watching her with the amber eyes. Her first coherent thought was that the rumours had undersold him. Her second was that she had forgotten to lower her eyes. She lowered them. Then, because it felt dishonest in a way she could not suppress, she raised them again. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not close to a smile, but a fractional adjustment. The way a blade turns slightly in the light when the hand holding it has decided something. "You are watching the room," he said. His voice was low and level, carrying no performance. The voice of someone long accustomed to being heard, without raising it, not performing for it. "It is habit, my lord," she said. "I grew up in rooms that required caution." "What is your name?" "Wren." "Of the Cavendish household, my lord, a ward of the outer staff." She held his gaze and added, because she could not let him discover it later and feel misled. "My mother launders the household linen. I was sent here to fill a number on a list. It is not a lineage that recommends itself to this hall." The silence that followed had texture to it, a quality of attention she felt on her skin. Lord Vane's voice cut across from the far side of the hall, pointed with implicit correction. "What is your lineage?" She did not look away from the king to answer. She had answered him already. Mordecai Ashenvane turned his amber eyes toward his chancellor. Something passed between them, a look with the quality of a closing door. Then he turned back to her. "I was not addressing Lord Vane," he said, with the complete flatness of a man who has decided something and cannot be revisited on it. "I was addressing my future queen." The great hall of Ashenmore went entirely silent. 43 women and the full assembled court of the Northern Territories held a collective breath. Lady Margrave, 2 rows ahead, made a small sound that was not kind. Lord Vane had gone very still. The high lords at the long table had leaned fractionally forward, their faces wearing the expression of people confronting something they were going to be spending a great deal of time processing. The 2 captains of the Ashguard at the doors had exchanged a single glance of the variety that means everything and communicates nothing. Wren could not move, not from fear, from the particular disorientation of having the ground shift under your feet when you have spent your entire life learning to stand carefully on shifting ground. She had been told what she was, her whole life. She had heard it in the rooms she was permitted to enter, the conversations that stopped when she appeared, the uneven stitching in the borrowed gown in 20 years of accumulated evidence about her position in the world. And this man, this king with 7 years of controlled distance in his amber eyes, had looked at all of that evidence and found it insufficient. She breathed. He was still watching her. not with the assessing look he had turned on the room, but with something between curiosity and recognition, the beginning of a question he had not yet decided whether to ask. She said, "My lord, I think you may be mistaken about who I am." "Tell me," he said, with the patience of a man who had no intention of being corrected, "what you believe I am mistaken about." So she told him. Not everything. She was not, despite what her directness might suggest, a fool. She told him about the borrowed gown and the uneven stitching. She told him that her name appeared on no document of quality anywhere in the Northern Territories. She told him she was here to fill a number on a list, and that mistaking her for anything more was a miscalculation she felt obligated to flag before it became his problem and not hers. When she finished, the court had not resumed breathing. The Alpha King said, "Are you done?" She considered. "Yes. Good." Lord Vane. The Chancellor crossed the hall with the rigid gait of a man exercising extraordinary self-control. "The remaining candidates will be housed in the Eastern Tower. Wren will be housed in the Queen's suite. Lady Margrave and Lord Cavendish are to be removed from proceedings. Their failure of duty to a woman in their household will be addressed separately." A pause. "You may deliver your objections in writing by the evening meal." He looked at her one final time. In that look was something that had no social convention around it, only the absolute certainty of a man who had made a determination and was done reconsidering it. Then he turned and walked back to the high table, and the great hall of Ashenmore exhaled. The steward who appeared at her elbow was wide-eyed and unsure what expression to wear. He said, "My lady," stumbled on the title, tried again. She followed him, and the court's voice found itself behind her as she crossed the threshold, and she walked out without looking back and discovered, to her own genuine surprise, that her hands were steady. That was unusual. Her hands were almost never steady. The Queen's suite was in the oldest part of the East Tower, larger than the entire ground floor of the Cavendish laundry. She stood in the centre of it, and read it the way she read all rooms. The exits, the fire recently laid and lit, the tray of bread and winter fruit on the writing table, the folded robe on the bed that looked approximately her size. Someone had prepared specifically for her. She noted that. She ate the bread, because she had not eaten since morning, and she needed to think clearly. And she thought. Lord Vane came before the dinner hour with the polished, careful manner of a man who had spent his life in the space between powerful people and was accustomed to absorbing the damage. He wanted her gone, with a compensation, sufficient to make the leaving comfortable, framed as generosity. She listened to his framing, watched his hands, and said, "You should have this conversation with the king." He looked at her for a long moment and said, with a reluctance that suggested it was genuine, "You are not what I expected." She said, "No, I imagine not. Good evening, my Lord Chancellor," and latched the door behind him. She did not sleep well, not from distress, from the particular alertness of standing at the edge of something very large and not yet knowing whether she was going to fall or fly. The days that followed were the most disorienting of her life, and not because they were difficult. They were disorienting because they kept being something other than what 20 years of experience had taught her to expect. The king asked her questions and listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who had decided that what she said was worth hearing. She had not been listened to like that before, not by anyone. The archivist Marit, a self-contained woman of middle age in scholar's robes, brought her documents she had not asked for but needed, apparently having decided on her own that Wren would want to understand the legal framework around the Queen's patents. She was right. The Ashguard captains, Fenwick and Bryn, assigned to accompany her, turned out to be the most practically useful sources of information in the fortress. Their knowledge of Ashenmore's architecture and daily patterns was precise and unglamorous, and exactly the kind of knowledge she had always found most valuable. She spent the hours reading documents, walking corridors, asking questions of the people who had actual information rather than performed information, the senior cook who knew everything, the head groom who was also the informal historian of the fortress's yard life, a minor clerk in the records office who had been at Ashenmore for 30 years and whose memory for dates was precise to the point of unsettling. And she watched the court watch her. She had become the most interesting problem in the fortress, a laundress's daughter, installed in the Queen's suite, walking the corridors with the ash guard, attending the morning councils in the borrowed gown with its uneven stitching, meeting every assessing look with the direct grey-green eyes that apparently unsettled people in ways they had not anticipated. Lord Edra, she noted, watched her differently than the others, not the social outrage of Lady Margrave's disapproval. Something more calculated, more careful, the look of a man performing a risk assessment. On the second afternoon, she went to the archivist's study and asked Merritt what she needed to understand. Merritt told her. The previous queen, Lyra Ashenvane, had died in the East Tower in the 4th year of her queenship. The official inquiry had designated it accidental. There were 3 lords currently on the King's Council, Edra Cassel Forthron, who had been in the fortress that night. There was evidence nearly complete. The king had been building it for 7 years. He brought a laundress's daughter into this court, Wren said slowly, and made a public declaration about her future title in front of those 3 lords. Merritt said nothing, which was its own answer. He needed something visible and immediate to shift the architecture of the court before his final move. Something that would read to anyone watching as personal sentiment, and read to someone who knew what was actually happening as a repositioning of the board. That is a conclusion you have reached yourself. Where is he now? She went to the lower armory. He was in shirt sleeves, working the edge of a blade with a whetstone in the pale horizontal light, alone. The room smelled of oil and cold metal and the particular mineral quiet of stone that had absorbed decades of the same work. She said, "Merritt told me." The whetstone moved with long, even strokes. "I know," he said. "You put me in danger without warning me." He set the whetstone down. He turned to face her fully, in his shirt sleeves, without the formal authority of his over-tunic and office. He looked precisely as formidable as in the great hall, a physical fact of the room rather than a ceremonial one. "Yes," he said. "I don't object to danger," she said. "I grew up in it. I understand rooms that have consequences. I don't object to being part of a strategy." She looked at him steadily. "I object to not being told." A silence that had the quality of a man genuinely receiving something. "Both things were true simultaneously," he said. "What I said to you in the hall, and what it served. I told you I had not made a spontaneous decision in 7 years. That was the truth. I also did not know how to separate the 2 things, and so I did not try. You should have told me." "Yes," he said. "I should have." She stood in the pale light of the armory and looked at him. The angular face with its controlled severity, the amber eyes, the scar on his right hand. And she understood, with the clarity she sometimes found in moments of genuine information, that she was standing next to someone who had learned the same lesson she had learned by a far harder method. 2 people who had been reading rooms for survival, the same school, the same curriculum, entirely different reasons for enrollment. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. He told her. When he finished, she understood the shape of 7 years of patient preparation. The documents, the assembled testimony, the 3 names and what lay behind them. What the final move required was witnesses of unimpeachable credibility in the court when the evidence was presented, people whose presence made denial structurally impossible. 3 days, he said, when the patents are signed. Then I will be there, she said. A silence. Outside the narrow armory windows, the afternoon was going grey. He said, "You stitched the hem yourself." She looked at him. "In the selection hall, the morning you arrived, the stitching on the hem. You did it yourself." "At midnight," she said. "By rushlight. I am aware of its quality." "I noticed it," he said, "because I noticed everything. Because that is what I do." The amber eyes held hers with a quality she was beginning to recognize. Not the strategic precision, not the controlled authority, but the thing underneath those. "I noticed it, and I did not find it insufficient. I found it honest." She had no response that was not too large for the room they were in. She filed the moment carefully, the way she filed everything, and made no performance of having received it. "Good evening, my lord," she said. "Good evening, Wren," he said, and went back to the blade. She had not calculated for what happened the morning of the 3rd day, before the formal assembly. She was crossing the inner ward with Bryn, when she heard the wolves for the first time. Not howling, but a low, sustained, unified sound from the enclosure. Against the east wall, 3 large grey animals watching the path ahead of her, with pale eyes and total stillness. She stopped walking. The sound was not aggressive. It was something stranger than that. A kind of attention that she felt on her skin, directed and deliberate. The way you feel it when something very old and very patient has decided to pay you its full regard. "The king's wolves," Bryn said, without being asked. "They have been like this since your arrival. The mate bond recognition. Pack animals sense it in the bloodlines, before it manifests consciously between people. They know what you are before you do." She stood and listened to them, and felt the thing she had felt when Mordecai Ashenvane first looked at her. The long-held structures of what she was, reorganizing themselves into something with a different shape. She did not have long to hold the feeling. 3 of Lord Edra's household guards stepped into the path ahead of her, deliberately, the way men step into paths when they want the stepping itself to be the message. They were large men in Edra's grey livery, and they had the particular stillness of people who had been waiting and were now performing their purpose. The largest said, flatly, "The laundress's daughter should walk by the kitchen door." Bryn's hand went to his blade. His face had gone to the controlled blankness of a man, performing the calculation of whether he was about to have to do something irreversible. Wren put her hand on Bryn's arm. Not to stop him. To hold the moment, to give herself one breath to read it correctly. The cold of the inner ward was in her lungs, and the flagstones were hard under her feet, and the grip of her hand on Bryn's forearm was steady. These men had been sent to frighten her, to make her understand that the Lord's displeasure had weight and reach, that a king's declaration and borrowed gowns were not sufficient against men who had managed this court for 7 years, who had managed a dead queen and 7 years of careful silence, and apparently believed they could manage this too. Behind her, the wolves had not gone quiet. She said very quietly, "Tell Lord Edra, I understand his message." She met the guard's eyes with the grey-green directness that had never successfully learned to look away from things. Tell him also that the woman who grew up in rooms that required caution does not frighten easily. And tell him that I have been reading this court since I arrived, and I have read him, and what he should be afraid of is not me. She walked past them. The guard did not move. The path to the east tower door was 4 stone steps and 15 yards of cobbled yard, and she walked it without looking back, and the wolves behind her had shifted from their low, unified sound to something closer to quiet, and she could feel the 3 guards watching her cross the yard and arrive at the door and go through it. Her hands were not steady this time. She noted that, honestly, and said nothing about it to Bryn, who walked beside her in the controlled tension of a man who had very much wanted to do something and been prevented from it. The final morning arrived. The patents were signed at the writing table in the Queen's suite. Witnessed by Merritt and Fenwick and Bryn, carried away by Lord Vane with the professional grace of a man who had done his work correctly and accepted, with discipline, that the world had gone in a direction he had not preferred. Wren dressed in the green gown. It was the only thing she had that was hers, the uneven stitching and all. The great hall held the full court in its most formal assembly. The room had the quality of a breath being held by 100 people simultaneously. Lord Edra was at his place, at the long table, and his posture carried the settled confidence of a man who had not yet understood that the thing he had built his comfort on had run out of time. Mordecai Ashenvane entered and took the high table. He said 3 names: Edra, Cassell, Forthron. Maret came forward with the document case. What followed was precise in the way of things built over 7 years by someone who knew that the architecture of proof must be airtight, because the men it was built against had spent 7 years building walls. Document by document, testimony by testimony, the morning light moved slowly across the floor of the great hall. Lord Edra's confidence collapsed, the way things collapse when their foundations have been quietly removed. First into challenge, then denial, then the terrible silence of a man who has exhausted his constructed responses and must finally face the room as it actually is. The Ashguard removed him. Cassell and Forthron were sequestered for separate proceedings. The remaining court stood in the stunned stillness of people who had been standing next to something for 7 years without seeing it clearly, and had just seen it. The king looked across the room to where she stood. She met his eyes. He did not look like a man who had won. He looked like a man who had done a necessary thing, and now had to decide what the morning after 7 years of waiting actually felt like, when the waiting was finally done. His face in the torchlight was all its angles and severity, and the particular openness of a person who has put something down at last and not yet picked anything up to replace it. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked up at the amber eyes, and in them was everything she had been watching build for 3 days. Not the strategic precision, not the controlled authority, but the thing underneath those, the quality of a man who had been alone in a particular way for a very long time and had arrived, without entirely planning it, at the end of that aloneness. She looked the way she always looked, directly, without flinching, and her copper-threaded hair had come loose from one of her mother's bone combs in the morning, and the borrowed gown still had its uneven stitching. And she was, in that moment, the most arresting thing in the room. She said, "It needed acknowledging." He looked at her. "All of it," she said. "The 7 years, the dead queen, the 3 men, the laundress's daughter, with the borrowed gown." She held the amber gaze and did not look away. Whatever comes next. The court was entirely still. Outside from the inner ward, she could hear the wolves. Not the tense alertness of 2 mornings ago, but something settled and continuous, a sound like a held note finding its resolution. He said, "Yes, all of it did." She thought about her mother's bone combs and the uneven stitching and the rushlight at midnight, and every room she had ever stood in that had told her what she was. She thought about what it meant to stand in this room instead, with the mountains outside and the wolves below, in a court that had just finished 7 years of carefully arranged silence, with this man whose amber eyes were not carrying their 7 years the way they had carried them that first morning. She thought about what it meant to grow up reading rooms for information rather than beauty, and to arrive at a room that contained both. Good, she said. And she stayed in it,